Alright, so we are now going to move on then to Chapter 10, which is all about social behaviors. And we're going to start by thinking kind of the questions of whether organisms are going to live in groups or not live in groups, some of the advantages and the disadvantages of group living, of social living, of socializing, of not being solitary. So we're going to start with this question: why is it beneficial to be in a group? What is the benefit to being with others? And we can start by imagining this group of zebra here that are feeding at this watering hole or watering at this watering hole. And we're going to say, all right, why be in that group? Why not be by yourself? One big reason to live in a group is that it may decrease your chances of getting eaten. Right? It may make it less likely for a predator to kill and consume you. One reason might be the warning. If you're in that big group of zebras and there's a lion who's sneaking up on you, well, there's a pretty good chance that one of them is going to see the lion before it gets to them and warn everybody else. Another reason would be that a group has a better chance of fighting back, right? Of predator attacks. Well, a bunch of individuals that are fighting together might be able to fight off a predator. Another reason that living in a group might be beneficial with regards to predation is something we're going to call the dilution effect. And the dilution effect basically says, well, maybe somebody's going to get eaten, but if you're in a group, the chances of it being you become smaller. That if you've got a group of 100 and one individual is going to get eaten that day, well, you've only got a 1% chance of it being you. If you're by yourself and the predator finds you, well, it is going to be you. Now, we also have to think about where an individual is in the group in relation to its predation risk. That an individual that's out on the edge of the group probably has a better chance of being taken by a predator than one who's in the middle of the group. What this means is, over time, we're often going to see the group is going to kind of trade places. That some individuals that are out on the edge, well, they're going to realize that they're more exposed and more danger, and so they're going to try to make their way toward the middle. Those in the middle, maybe feeding along happily, are all of a sudden going to realize they're out on the edge, and they're going to try to start making their way then toward the middle. All right, so there's this preferred space in a group to, again, make the chances of being eaten even lower. There's also the confusion possibility. If you're a lion and you go running into that group of zebras, it might be hard to really focus in on a single individual. There'll be a lot going on, black and white stripes everywhere. And so, if you can confuse the predator, it might make it harder for that predator to single one individual out and kill and consume them. Another benefit of being in a group is that it might make it easier to find food. Lots of individuals looking for food means there's probably a better chance of finding that food. Additionally, when it's time for the mating season, it's going to be easier to find a mate because individuals are all together already. Now, I also want to point out that often being in a group is not just being about in being the same place, but we also have temporal groupings. So groups of the same time. My classic example of this is going to be a cicada. If we think about cicadas, some years there's just huge numbers of cicadas. Like ridiculous, overwhelming numbers. What eats cicadas? Well, during those years when there are just cicadas everywhere, everything's going to eat cicadas. Things you might not think about eating cicadas are going to start eating cicadas. Things that you expect to eat cicadas, let's say raccoons. Raccoons are going to eat tons of cicadas. Skunks are going to eat tons of cicadas. Possums are going to eat tons of cicadas. But even things like deer may start eating cicadas on years when there are lots of cicadas around. However, no matter how many animals start eating cicadas and how many raccoons are feasting on cicadas, they're never going to be able to eat all of the cicadas. There are just so many cicadas that temporal group, that group in time, that all emerging at the same time, is going to basically overwhelm the possibility of predators eating them all. That what's going to happen is the predators are going to eat lots of cicadas, but they're going to eat to the point of being satiated. Satiation means they've eaten all they can eat. They can't eat anymore. When that happens, well, the cicadas that are left over get to survive and reproduce really well because the predators have eaten all that they can. And so that grouping in time, that temporal group, serves to allow most cicadas to survive and reproduce. Yes, some of them are going to get eaten by those predators that decide that it's time for them to eat cicadas. But a lot of them are going to make it. And so if you think about that with regards to that temporal grouping, that means if you're a cicada that comes out in one of those years that's not a big year for cicadas, well, your chances of getting eaten just go up dramatically. That you don't have all those other cicadas to be the ones that get eaten first, that it's probably just going to be you. So there's a strong selection pressure for those cicadas to all emerge at the same time. The more they emerge at the same time, the better chance. If you've taken BIO330, you might remember this idea of stabilizing selection. Selection against variation, selecting for the middle, selecting for everybody to emerge at that same time, maximizes survival and reproduction for everybody. All right, well, let's look at things from the opposite way. Why not be in a group, right? You don't have to live in a group. There are some benefits to live a solitary life. One reason to not hang out in a group is that when you're in a group, you might have a higher chance of predation just because you're so conspicuous, right? If we look at this flock of blackbirds, there's no way a predator's not going to notice they're there, right? They're going to see them. It's going to be much easier to hide if you're a single individual out in the countryside as opposed to this group of individuals. Another reason that groups might be dangerous is that if there's a disease that occurs, well, if you're in a big group, it's a pretty good chance it's going to get passed to everybody. That it's tough to avoid a disease if you're in a group. If you're living by yourself, you don't interact with individuals of your species very often, you have a better chance of avoiding that disease. If you're in a big group, there's going to be a lot of competition. You're going to be in the same area, trying to eat the same food as everybody else in your group. Finally, there's a danger for group living organisms that the members of the group tend to be individuals to whom they're closely related. And so when they do choose their mates from that group, there's the danger that those individuals are going to be someone they're related to, increasing the chance of inbreeding. One thing that we often see happen when organisms live in groups is that to avoid some of those problems we see with group living, they may set up territories. Right? Territories being basically an area that they are going to defend from any other individuals. And so we got a picture here of a bunch of penguins living in this breeding groups, and each pair of penguins is going to have its own little breeding territory. It's going to be separate from everybody else. That way they're sort of able to divide up the resources to have what they still need by defending it and preventing others from using it. Now, there is an issue that happens sometimes, though, in species maybe that don't move around a lot. They might have, species that do move around a lot, they might not be able to set up a geographic territory. They might need to have some other way of dividing up resources. And in those species, we might have the development of a dominance hierarchy. Right? Think about this group of elephants we have in the picture here. There's a lot of elephants that are traveling in this group. They're probably not staying in the same exact geographic area for a long time, and there are so many elephants that the territory that they would set up would have to be so large that they wouldn't really be in a group anymore, and yet elephants are group-living organisms. So in those sorts of situations, there's this dominance hierarchy develops that helps to determine who has access to which resources first. And it's based on the social ranking of the individuals in the group. And so in the case of the elephants that we see here, the individuals with the highest social rank are the old females. Now, we might ask the question, well, why would the old females be the most highly socially ranked? If you have limited resources, wouldn't it be better to have those resources go to, I don't know, let's say young females who have many years of reproduction ahead of them? Why would you favor the individuals that are the oldest, that are the closest to death? Well, the answer seems to be that for the benefit of all, it's better to have the oldest females in the highest positions of dominance, because they're the ones who know stuff. That it's the old females who guide the group, who have the memory of where the resources are most available, of where they're most likely to find what they need. And if those old females don't survive, well, the whole group probably doesn't survive. And so, the social ranking maximizes the survival of everyone by allowing the resources to become most available to those who are going to be most beneficial to the group. Alright, so I want to now think about, let's say within that group of elephants, the actual interactions that happen between individuals. So we're going to say these are intraspecific interactions, the way that members of a group interact with each other on an individual basis. And we're going to divide these interactions into basically two sides. That every time you have a social interaction between two individuals, you're going to have a donor individual and a recipient individual. So these are some terms that come from, I think, sociology. The idea here is the donor individual is the individual that carries out the act, the one who does it. The recipient is the one who's affected by it, right? So the donor is making the decision to do something. The recipient is receiving that act, is the one that's affected by that act. Taking into account this idea of donor carrying out an act and affecting a recipient, we can sort of divide the outcome of social interactions into four possibilities. So on the y-axis here, we have the fitness effects on the donor, so the one who's choosing to do the act. And on the x-axis, we have the fitness effects on the recipient, so the one who's receiving, who's being affected by the act. Now, as we look at our possibilities, we see that we have the possibility of being positive for the donor and positive for the recipient, positive for the donor, negative for the recipient, negative for the donor, positive for the recipient, and negative for the donor, and negative for the recipient. Well, it's easy to see why the top two might develop, right? The top two are beneficial for the one who's doing the act, who's carrying out this, whatever this behavior is. And so it makes sense, well, of course, they're going to do it because, well, they're beneficial to them. So it has a positive consequence for the individuals who are actually carrying out the act. Now, in the bottom right here, we have the situation of spitefulness, where it's a negative consequence for the one who carries out the act and the negative consequence for the one who receives it. Turns out this is unknown in nature. Organisms just don't do this. Now, we might find this in humans. There might be situations where individuals do something negative that hurts themselves, but they do it because they want to also hurt others. But in nature, we don't find spitefulness. All right, so that leaves us then with the bottom left there, altruism, where it is a negative consequence for the one who does it and a positive consequence for the one who is benefited. And we can imagine this by looking at these pandas. All right, so the lower panda is trying to help the other panda get up there. But, you know, it's still a lot of work for that lower panda, and there's a pretty high probability from the looks of things that the uppermost panda is going to fall down on the lowermost panda. The lowermost panda is probably not going to get anything good out of this, but is probably going to have a negative consequence. while the uppermost panda is getting the benefit, the help of getting where it wants to go. So the question is, well, why would altruism develop? Why would an individual ever help another individual, even though it's bad for the individual doing the helping? There's seemingly no positive consequence. There's just a detriment. If I have $40, why would I ever give you the $40? Why would I benefit you? It's a negative consequence for myself. Well, I want to think about those pandas for a second. Do you think they know each other? Do you think they've spent a lot of time together? Do you think that maybe they're related? That maybe they're related to each other? There's a pretty good chance that those pandas are probably siblings. Alright, so when we're thinking about benefits, we are usually thinking about what we're going to call direct fitness. Right? The fitness of that individual reproducing, passing on its genes to the next generation. But in order to see and understand what's happening with altruism, we might have to bring in the concept of indirect fitness. Indirect fitness basically says, even if I'm not reproducing, it's possible for my relatives to reproduce. And guess what? My relatives, well, they share a lot of genes with me. 50%, if we're thinking about a pair of siblings. Right? So what that means is that even if I'm not reproducing, I might be able to get my genes into the next generation indirectly by helping my offspring, helping my relatives, including potentially offspring, but also brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, helping them reproduce. Now, we can apply this to the thinking of altruism. Who are the people you're most likely to help? Right? Imagine somebody coming up to you and asking to borrow $20. If it's a brother or a sister, you're probably going to say yes. A parent, pretty good chance. An aunt or uncle, yeah, pretty good. A first cousin, yeah, there's a good chance. A second cousin twice removed, a random person on the street, yeah, maybe. Depends. The more close related someone is to us, the more likely we are to help them. And there are actually could be situations, right, where an organism might make a decision to choose indirect fitness over direct fitness because it might be, from a fitness standpoint, more advantageous. Right, so let's for example, imagine that you have a situation where you have the opportunity to either produce offspring or with I keep hitting the wrong buttons. With indirect fitness, produce offspring through a relative. Not through a relative, but help a relative produce offspring. So let's imagine the situation here. Let's imagine as yourself, you have the opportunity to have one offspring. Or, let's imagine that you could help maybe a sibling have 3 offspring. Direct fitness, 1 offspring. Indirect fitness, 3 offspring. And let's imagine for our purposes these are mutually exclusive. You have to choose one or the other. When you say I can have my own offspring, that'll be pretty good. But maybe it'd be better to help my sibling have offspring. Well, we might need to do a little math here to figure out which one is better. Alright, so if you have 1 offspring, that offspring is related to you by having half of your genes. That means that half of your genes make it to the next generation. Now, with a sibling, they have half of your genes, they share half of your genes, and so their offspring would share half of their genes. That means your niece or nephew would have a quarter of your genes. So, they have 3 offspring. Each of them shares a quarter of your genes. 3 times a quarter, 0.75. So, you have a greater genetic contribution to the next generation by indirect fitness as opposed to direct fitness. That in that case, there would be more fitness in indirectly helping one of your siblings reproduce than in you yourself reproducing. That is the explanation for altruism. Kin selection. Kin are those you're related to. Helping your kin based on your selflessness, your apparent good deeds to help them. From a fitness standpoint, this only makes sense if those that you are helping are going to be those that are related to you, and so your genes are being carried to the next generation through that indirect fitness. In some species, we have a really extreme example of that. We have some species that have what we're going to call eusocial groups. Eusocial groups, we find these in a lot of, not a lot, in some of these insects. So, bees and ants, for example, are in the Hymenoptera. Termites are in Isoptera. These often have eusocial groups. Some species of mole rats are some mammals that have these eusocial groups. And there are some specific conditions that tend to give rise to eusocial groups. We have species that live in groups all the time, sort of extreme group living. In order for eusocial groups to develop, there have to be overlapping generations, so the parents and the offspring have to be alive at the same time. And there's a lot of cooperation that develops. That cooperation is developed to the point so extreme that only a few individuals in the group actually breed. So, if we think about our group of our honeybees here in the picture, out of those thousands of honeybees that are in the hive, probably only a single individual is going to reproduce. Just the queen is the only female that's going to reproduce. There's so much cooperation that all the rest of them go about their normal daily lives, do all the work, but never have offspring themselves. Why? Indirect fitness. That those individuals are willing to sacrifice their own reproduction because everybody in the hive is related. And by helping out the hive, they increase the success of reproduction of the queen, so that indirectly their genes make it into the next generation. Right? This is, you can kind of, you almost think about a eusocial group as sort of like a superorganism. Right? It's kind of like, even though those are each individual bees, they're kind of functioning almost like the cells in a body. Right? Just like how your skin cells, well, they don't get carried to the next generation, but they're carrying out their function so that when reproduction does occur, they are going to have their DNA, which is shared by all the cells in the body, get passed on to the next generation. Eusocial groups are an extreme form of group living where individuals completely sacrifice themselves for the good of the group because the good of the group is the good of their fitness. In the case of those mole rats, for example, these naked mole rats that we see in the picture, which are pretty cute, you have to admit, pretty cute looking mole rats. These naked mole rats also have eusocial groups, although the mechanism is a little bit different. So in the naked mole rats, there's a single pair of the top, socially ranked top, male and female, are the only ones that reproduce. And it's kind of interesting, the other individuals could reproduce, But they don't, because the top male and female harass them so much and cause them so much stress that they don't really go into a reproductive state because they're being bullied all the time by the top male and female. As long as that is top male and female are still alive, they're harassing all the other rats and keeping them from reproducing. If a male or female dies, then one of the other male or female then becomes socially dominant and then harasses all the others to keep them from reproducing. And so same sort of thing, indirect fitness. The mechanism is a little jerky, but is effective at the same sort of function as what we would see in a beehive or an ant colony.